Welcome everyone. Today we have very important discussions and dialogue on finance. We have our world famous speakers, Mr. Marshall, Professor David Smith. Beside that, we have our other teammates, Mr. Mark, Hena, Jack, Ruby, and Mr. Mike. You know that World Talent Economy Forum, our major objective is economy. We want to focus on the economical sustainability. Climate change is a very important issue, especially for developing world. I'm from a developing man from a developing world. I know my country suffer a lot for this climate change. We do not know, even my land where I born, I do not know it we will survive or not. So I'm a big fan of this climate change initiative. Even we do a lot of discussion with Mr. Marshall. Already, Mr. Marshall is very popular in World Talent Economy Forum. Professor David Smith also contribute a lot for World Talent Economy Forum, and I want to welcome all of the new speakers for today's dialogue because this is not only the economical sustainability we will discuss about how we can change human lives, how we can change the developing worlds. And I know many of the people in the developing world, they do not know what kind of initiative they can take. And I know Mr. Marshall, Mr. David Smith, and all of the speakers, they know what to do. Personally, 3 years before, I visited many West related projects in developing worlds. I work with many city mayors, and we go for dialogues, and we develop some feasibility study. And I saw that it's completely challenge for developing world. So I believe the developed worlds like today's speakers, if we can work together, if we can contribute together, we can find out the solutions for waste management, for public private partnership, for the new economical challenges. So Mr. Marshall, I want to give you floor. I'm a big fan of your organizations, even Professor David Smith, and I'm a big fan of your knowledge, how you're contributing through the World Talent Economy Forum. This is important. My questions, what you want to offer, Mr. Marshall, for our audience, especially the developing world's audience.
Thank you, Sharif, for hosting this panel. It's my understanding that this will be one of a series of panels that we'll be doing on mobilizing climate finance for the world, and especially for the developing world. So I'm going to first give you a little intro, and then I'm going to introduce some of the panelists, and then we'll go from there. Right now, there is an urgent need to increase finance for climate adaptation and resilience and carbon sequestration. Despite international recognition that both mitigation and adaptation efforts are essential, adaptation funding remains a far smaller portion of the total climate finance that has been out there. The United Nations Environmental Protection Agency estimates that by 2030, adaptation and resilience, also known as ANR, the needs could reach $300 billion US per year in developing countries. While the Climate Policy Initiative found that ANR finance flows measured in 2018, prior to the pandemic, reached only $30 billion, of which only $500 million was formed from private sources. Well, after COP26, there is good news. I know a lot of people out there that followed COP26 felt that it wasn't that great of a success, but actually there is a success out of it. One of the achievements of COP26 was that it placed a focus on sustainable finance. Post COP26, a group known as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, also known as GFANZ Alliance, has amassed 130 trillion USD, I'm going to say that again, 130 trillion US dollars to be deployed towards carbon capture, adaptation, and resilience. It's required by this group. It's their mandate. Most of these funds are intended to be accessed by third world development banks or central banks. However, there are several challenges and opportunities that we're going to discuss today. But before I get into that, I'm going to kind of introduce you to the panelists. First of all, we have David Smith, who is going to be acting with our group to create public-private partnerships, because in this regard, the GFANZ funding has to be done through a private-public partnership. It's not like it can be done between corporations. Its mission is stated. It's been adopted by the countries that became part of the alliance, and that is a requirement. So we need somebody who has knowledge and success in creating private-public partnerships, and that is our friend David Smith, who I've had the pleasure and the honor of being on several panels with him. In addition to that, on the panel, we have Jake Haka. Jake is a lead, has aspects of the climate bond market in Luxembourg, which is important because that's going to be one of the missions, one of the methods to be able to risk mitigate the GFANZ funds for the banks that are going to acquire those funds, and justify to GFANZ that those funds will be spent properly and on ANR and carbon sequestration. In addition to that, next to him is Hina Shah. Hina Shah is both an engineer in two forms. She's an engineer having to do with the environmental engineer, but also a civil engineer. She has a dual degree there. And she has recently been authorized or taken and I'll let her explain it better than me, the course in Washington, D.C. on Sustainable Development Goals by the UN. There are 17 of them. There are lots of protocols underneath them. And in order for the Climate Bond Initiative to help risk mitigate the GFANZ funds for the banks, we are actually, not theory, we are actually going to be funding the opportunities of developing SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And Hina will kind of speak to that. In addition to that, we have Mark Sabin. Mark has, he's on our team. He understands the multiple technology deployments that address improving soil, cleaning up water, generating local power from waste, and reducing GHG emissions. He'll kind of speak to the technology and how that gets involved. Then we have, next to that, we have Mike Drips on my lower left on the screen. Michael his role is that he is going to talk about the Luxembourg Green Exchange. He's going to kind of explain the background of it, because the Luxembourg Green Exchange, the European Union climate bonds under their various taxonomies will all go through the Luxembourg Green Exchange, and that will help create value, but also risk mitigation to the GFANZ and to the central banks and their development banks. And then finally, we have Ruby. Whoops, Ruby disappeared on me for a second. So Ruby Kim, who's coming back on, has experience, and she's working with all sorts of developments. She's an award-winning entrepreneur in Europe in different projects. She working with us to talk about working with development people around the world, and especially in third world economies and entities and joint ventures. The basic premise is to create joint ventures, and the joint ventures will be public-private partnerships, as I stated earlier. Okay, so I'm just going to go in and talk to some of the issues, and then I'm going to hand it off. So some of the barriers of policy actions and options for the green bond market, which includes the climate bond initiative market, are that they were enumerated in the 2017 OECD report. There was a lack of awareness of the benefits of green bonds and existing international guidelines and standards. Now, remember, this is back in 2017. There was a lack of local green bond guidelines. The cost of meeting green bond requirements was high. The lack of green bond ratings and indices and listings was an issue. And the lack of supply of labeled green bonds and the difficulties for international investors to access local markets, and a lack of domestic green investors. Well, all that has changed since the pandemic in 2020. In March of 2020, the EU made a commitment to all the members of the EU countries to become a circular economy. And in a way, by doing that, it allows developing countries to participate in that circular economy in a very interesting method. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So the method that we're going to bring to the table is GFANZ will supply the funds, but GFANZ has an issue. How do they know that the funds will be allocated properly and that they will be held accountable? Well, the Climate Bond Initiative gives us that mechanism to do that. And it allows the funds to go into the central banks of these third world developing countries, and they can act as guarantors to the public-private partnerships and bring some of the capital to bring the bond to market. The bond then repays the capital, and then we are off employing the technologies that Mark will talk about. So that's basically my intro to the concept. I'm going to now hand it off to David to talk about private-public partnerships.
Yes, Professor David Smith. One thing, as you discuss about public-private partnership, closely, last couple of years, we are working with different countries' government, especially developing world, for this public-private partnership. Yes, from Malaysia to Bangladesh, Jilmili project for public-private partnership. I know the chairman of this corporation, Dr. Sabrina. She is successful, but many of the projects of public-private partnership not successful. That is one of the questions, even in the after the COP26. What is your advice? How they can make, especially developing world, can make more successful public-private partnership?
Sharif, you always ask the best questions. I'm going to use a couple of slides as we talk about this answer for you, but I'm going to give you an answer you probably haven't heard yet. If you look at public-private partnerships, they come in all different sizes and flavors. And I've been fortunate to have been the founders of two different consortia, which are really public-private partnerships when it looks how you change things. I was an executive at the MCC consortia and helped one of the founders of it, and an executive at the Cemitec consortia. The MCC consortia was designed to recover the computer industry back to the United States. The Cemitec consortia was designed to recover the semiconductor industry back to the United States. And these are ones that were very high stake. And public-private partnerships, or P3s, are really ideally suited for solving problems that it's going to take a wider group of people to solve. In those instances, it took academia, it took big companies, it took small companies, it took the government, all coming together to put the partnership in place to solve those really global issues and global problems. And I was very fortunate. At Cemitec, I had the privilege of leading the very first industrial roadmap for an industry ever done in the United States, coming out of a public-private partnership, and really looking at how that works. So as you look at what makes them successful, it's really a couple of things. One of them is that you really have to define well the stakeholders who are going to be part of it. And you really want to go to the concept that I've talked about before of the technopolis. And what I maybe should do is pull up a real quick slide to kind of let you visualize that. So let me share my screen a minute. And can you see that slide?
Yes.
I think I can. You can? Okay. So what we're doing with this is we're looking at kind of the next gen rate. And a P3 is really putting together a product to advance technology and globalization issues. And this is one where it really fits that well. And it's a new regional model. In the past, where we looked at addressing issues like this, it was trying to do everything in a self-contained region. Today, that's really gone away, where we see more collaboration between regions and others. One of the things Marshall and Sharif have heard me say, is geography is no longer a point on a map. It's where you have the competencies and capabilities to do what you need done. And I'm going to jump over some, but what we're really seeing is a concept called the technopolis. And it's one that links all of this together. So a technopolis is where you take education, the large companies, the emergent companies, the entrepreneurs, federal government, state government, local government, and support groups, and pull them together in this network to form these joint ventures that can work well. Where I've seen just a couple of these come together, the joint ventures are not as successful. The public private partnerships are not as successful. And there's two key assumptions here. The rapid increases in technologies changing the nature of economic competition. And in this particular area, that rapid increase in technology is actually causing some of the issues, which is changing the nature of economic competition too. And that the whole nature of this collaboration is fundamentally changing, much like we've seen the other things changing the world. And it really is how education, industry, and government come together to support creativity and innovation to be happen. Um, and this is how you push the pieces together. And you take the community, you take the talent, the technology, the capital, and the know-how balanced against what we need to do, and you have successful value add technology commercialization. And it really solves the problems. And what we've seen also today is that very simple Technopolis wheel is expanded now with more entrepreneurship, more education, global technology, which have come into play. And that really is some of the very, at the high level, the basics of what we see in setting up these type of public-private partnerships. And so the key to answer your question, Sharif, is making sure that you have the correct stakeholders at the table, that you clearly define what you want to do. Can you begin to put it in a way that the criteria for success, like the ones Marshall talked about in his introduction, are well understood? And because of those, you can be successful. Last thing is you have to understand to move the outputs from public private partnership, it's kind of like a rope. It's really hard to push a rope. It's much easier to pull a rope, and you're more successful pulling a rope. The other criteria that many public private partnerships forget is that they set and do things internally and accomplish some things internally, but they never are able to take and transfer that out to the public. They're never able to implement that in the real world. And that's the other important consideration when you're starting these is you can't push that rope. You have to create the pull. And many public private partnerships, particularly the ones which are politically driven, tend to forget the fact that you have to create successful transfer for any public private partnership to be successful. So, Sharif, I hope that answered your question.
Excellent, excellent. I think, Mr. Mark, I can ask question, Mr. Mark Sabin.
Yes.
I have detailed things because when I arrange this dialogue, because a long time developing world they are struggling with this waste management. Second things, for developing world, this is another challenges I believe, uh, that what is the right technology? That is the question from government, from city mayor, from consultant, from expert. And if you ask me why last 3 years we cannot finish this kind of waste management project because of, uh, I want to say, lack of technology. So if you briefly explain some point about your organizational technology, which will be helpful to solve problem of Asia Pacific, of developing world problem. I can give you a case study example of when I work with the Chittagong uh, city mayors. Every day they produce 3,000 metric tons waste. And remember, 3,000 peoples, they engage, like 3,000 family engage with this process. They do not have advanced supply chain. They do not have advanced mechanism to solve this problem. Yes, air pollutions and water pollution, another challenging things. How your technology can be helpful for developing world.
Well, thanks, Sharif, and thanks for having this and hosting this event for us to speak on these issues. What part of the issue that happens in technology is that there are sort of two strains of ways that technology is being developed. One of them is to create new technologies that have not been tested, and there are other technologies that have been used for a lengthy time. And one of the things that we have been using is pyrolysis, which is heating in the absence of oxygen, in order to be able to convert waste into usable resources. So this idea that we can transform waste into something that becomes usable and also has the advantages that it sequesters carbon and gets to be used in other things that can now be repurposed for using in specific ways to be able to actually mitigate some of the pollution problems that are plaguing a lot of the third world countries. So, for instance, if we're taking waste that comes out of an area and in this local area, and we can convert that waste into a high carbon char, that char can then be used to actually help clean up the water. We have other technologies that we engage with that as well. So we're not just reliant on one technology, but the key here is that the technology has been around for more than 80 years. So we're not talking about something that hasn't been tried and true, but is actually something that has been used and has been implemented across the world in many, many different forms. The difference being that one of the ways that is now possible to sequester carbon and begin to remove carbon out of the atmosphere is to be able to use pyrolysis and create these chars, which are actually designated as one of the solutions for reducing carbon in the atmosphere. So that's one component of it, which is the pyrolysis. And those systems can then be placed near the sources of the waste. So they can be locally deployed so that in the area where that system gets deployed, you're actually processing the local waste and converting it into something of value. So in light of what David was talking about in terms of the public-private partnerships, you're also bringing in economic benefits as well as environmental benefits into those communities where you can place these systems. In addition to that, we have other technologies that we're deploying that can do things like reoxygenate water so that the water then can begin to consume some of the pollutants through a natural process, the eutrophication process, which happens in water where things are decaying. That begins to consume the oxygen in the water. By replacing the oxygen in the water, we can actually help that process to, again, facilitate the natural process of the water resolving its pollution, removing the toxins out of the water, and reoxygenating it for the aquatic life. So the aquatic life then begins to reemerge. And we have other technologies that we have. Another technology that we use is that when you're using the pyrolysis equipment, you produce a certain amount of other, you produce heat, you also produce syngas. And one of the technologies that we deploy is an engine technology that is actually non-polluting and consumes the syngas. So what we have done is this whole process is to create a circular system that the system produces its own energy, it functions to feed itself so that it no longer has to take energy.
Yeah, I really think that's the right approach here.
Sorry, David? Oh. So we can take that and we can create that, this whole idea of the circular economy becomes part of the mix of what we're doing there. And as we deploy these different technologies, we can have other technologies that we can use to actually clean up even some of the microbial life out of the water with another technology through filtration systems and deploying the char that is being created by the pyrolysis systems, and then using that char for these different functions. So they can be used for anything from building materials to filtration materials in a whole host. There are hundreds of thousands of uses for this, depending on the type of char that's being produced in the pyrolysis, and that will then be related to what's happening in the local economy. But the whole process here is to be able to do that in that joint private-public partnership so that you can actually begin to restore the economy of the local area, deal with the environmental issues of the local area, and also provide social benefits into the local area because you're creating jobs, you can create education, there are a host of other things.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Hena, like we want to know more about circular economy. And beside that, like how actually after the COP26, Mr. Marshall already discussed about the financial strategy and the other things. So how does it work? What is your advice? Do you think it's practically applicable in the developing world? Hena.
Oh, sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Do you mind
Okay,
repeating that one more time?
we want to know more about circular economy, and some of the financial strategy after the COP26. That how this strategy actually helpful for the developing world.
And I might add how it add, because Hina's expertise is in SDGs. So in other words,
Yes.
SDGs play that role in that process. Go ahead, Hina.
Yes.
Sure. So a company at minimum must meet one of the sustainable goals of the UN in order to obtain an EU climate bond under all current taxonomies. Right. And currently, 8 companies who have issued climate bonds have met 2 of the SDGs, and only 1 company has met 4. ART has received a letter of fit for a climate bond under the waste management taxonomy. And remarkably, we meet 14 out of the 13 SDGs, which is extremely important for moving toward a circular economy. Now, Mark has explained kind of the nuance in the science and how we meet these, but why does this matter? And I've been noticing some of the other questions that are being asked during this panel, I think, in the chat. This climate crisis is a multidisciplinary issue that impacts people and the environment. We're one of the first and only organizations to meet this framework to reduce inequities while implementing biochar's circular carbon capture technology in a way that creates value for all stakeholders. And I think, Marshall, if you want to jump in on some of the more nuanced ways in which we're choosing to finance this.
Thank you. Mr. Jack, there are some basic questions from our audience. Onika Shams want to know, like, emergency, like why the climate emergency is important. What do you think? What is your views about this climate emergency?
Sorry, was that a question to me?
Yes, Jack.
Why
Yes.
why is there a climate emergency?
Yes, why climate emergency is important. Like we
Why
have
is
to
it
think
important?
about.
Oh,
Yes.
absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, so first of all, hi everyone. This is, I guess, my first time talking on the panel here. My name is Jake. I'm a lawyer at a law firm called King and Spalding, and I'm based in New York City. The climate emergency is crucial because we all want to have a planet, regardless of our location on the planet, that is hospitable. A planet on which we can live and where we can expect that our children and our children's children will reasonably have an opportunity to live themselves in the future. And there is, a risk at hand with the speed at which climate is changing that our planet may not be hospitable for humans in the near to medium term, which is very, very worrisome. But one of the things that is always difficult to get people to do is to do anything if they don't see a personal benefit from it. So what is the easiest way to get somebody to feel a personal benefit? Pay them. So that is where climate finance has come into a wonderful, it's created a wonderful opportunity to pay people for doing good by supplying their finance for things that will save the climate and therefore save the planet and also pay them. It's a very motivating thing to be able to not only save this planet in the ideological sense that we all hope to and talk about in our living rooms, but also be able to assist our bank accounts in the form of investment.
Thank you. Mr. Mike, what you want to add for this today's dialogue, especially about sustainable development goal and how it will be helpful. Specifically, I want to add one practical experience. Even the developing world, if many largest corporations they are engaging with developing world, they work with different corporations and the government body, but 90% people you ask them about sustainable development goal, I'm sure they cannot give you the right answer. So how
Yeah.
we can create awareness?
Well, if you could,
So hello everyone. My name is Mike Drips. I work in finance and financial services here in Luxembourg. I'll talk a little bit about what you just brought up, Sharif. Thanks very much for organizing this. Thanks, Marshall, for getting the group together. And I'll also talk a little bit more about green finance specifically here in Luxembourg. So to answer your question directly, that's sort of a nomenclature question, and that's very common now in green finance. There's a lot of terms flying around, not a lot of consistent definitions yet. The general reason for that is a lot of this is new, at least as it involves the private sector. It's been around in terms of intergovernmental organizations for more than a decade. The first kind of large financing that we would consider under the umbrella of what we're talking about now would be from the World Bank, those kind of issuances. And to echo on a point that Marshall made about the importance of the Luxembourg Green Exchange, which is a part of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange here in Luxembourg. It's not the only place where this kind of financing can be found. Indeed, there are competitors in other large financial centers in Europe, in London, in Frankfurt, Amsterdam. But what makes it so different here in Luxembourg is it is the biggest that we're talking about in terms of sheer numbers of listings, both in debt securities, which are far more common, and then equity securities also. And the reason for that has to do with the European institutions, specifically here in Luxembourg. In Brussels, that's the more well-known seat of government for the EU. That's where the Commission sits, where the Parliament sits when it's not in Strasbourg, and the European Central Bank is in Frankfurt. But what's here in Luxembourg is the European Investment Bank, and that's sort of equivalent to the World Bank or the IMF.
And Mike, wouldn't you say as well that Brussels and Frankfurt are both in proximity to Luxembourg? So even if they aren't in Luxembourg City, you have sort of a really nice geographical location to get access to these other places.
That's right, absolutely, and better highways to Frankfurt than to Brussels, to be sure. But it's all centrally located very much. And this year, the Luxembourg Green Exchange passed its 1,000th issuance of a green issuance, whereas other exchanges in Europe are hovering closer to the 500 mark. And the European Investment Bank, it being here in Luxembourg, the other main EU governmental organ that is permanently here is the European Court of Justice. But the European Investment Bank has issued, I think it was in fact the issuer that took the Luxembourg Green Exchange over the 1,000 mark. The current CEO of the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, which again the Luxembourg Green Exchange is a part of, was the founder of the Green Exchange. So that sort of signals the importance that the Luxembourg Stock Exchange itself places on green finance here in Luxembourg. And going back to the question that you raised about why there's not all this knowledge out there, the Luxembourg Green Exchange itself is only 5 years old. So that's not all that much history. And things like the SFDR, which is more about disclosure and captures some of the same themes that the SDGs promulgated by the UN do. The taxonomies of the CBI, which is a private organization that allows interoperability of terms and marketing across different markets. That nomenclature sometimes lines up perfectly, sometimes different, but it's all relatively new. And so getting it out there and getting it known and getting it front and center for finance is really important. And one other thing that I'll say generally is that when instruments are listed on the stock exchange, the green exchange here in Luxembourg. Unlike private listings, private debt listings of non-green or non-sustainable finance, you may not have an oversubscription. You may have an IPO as a different type of listing that doesn't necessarily have its shares or its bonds fully subscribed. But when there's a green finance issuing, those are in all cases oversubscribed. And that's because of this movement of green finance and the intergovernmental push happening right now. Most private fund managers have requirements to have a certain amount of their funds invested into green and sustainable finance. So it is picking up, it is taking off, and Luxembourg will probably remain in the center of that as far as the EU is concerned.
Thank you, Mr. Mike. Ruby, I have a different question for you because in Asia Pacific, specifically China Belt and Road Initiative, it's aggressive. China Belt and Road Initiative actually taking a lot of initiative and many projects happening in Asia Pacific through this Belt and Road Initiative. But what do you think? Uh, After this COP26, do you believe that for developing a sustainable ecosystem that USA and China and all of the G20 can work together to handle these climate change issues?
Thank you, Sharif, firstly, for also inviting me onto your panel as well. Thank you for Marshall also to set all of this up. Thank you for your question. I think that I personally am not too idealistic. I'm very realistic about expectations and really what it takes for different countries to come together with their own reasons behind wanting to push environmental and sustainable business as well as initiatives and laws. I think, as you know, we need a lot of help from the public sector and the private sector, but especially the public sector, because without creating laws to help the change go forward, how are we going to be able to intelligently move in the right steps? You know, I can't speak for China. I've never been, and I don't really know deeply about laws. But I can say, at least in the US, having been from there, but living in Europe and working with a lot of, APAC countries, I can say that the need is everywhere. And where we can make the most impact is perhaps in the APAC region. Um, and how we can do that is through a lot of sources of green finance, but we definitely need that public and private sector help. So I think that's where people like David will come into play in the future to really help people like Mike and Jake getting on the green finance part. We need more people like this to understand and connect what we do in the private sector to more public initiatives.
Thank you, Ruby. Mr. Marshall, actually, very important point that for climate financing, for solving these climate change issues, uh, different public and private corporation, we need to work together. We need to solve problem, uh, and we need to overcome from the challenging situation. So, what do you think? How your corporation can manage this challenging job?
Well, that's an excellent question, Sharif, and it really comes to what everybody's been talking about on this panel. There are two items I'm going to address right away. First, your question, and then there's a question in the chat about why is it critical now. So basically, to answer your question, what we're doing is we're actually bringing a tool to GFANZ, which has that 130 trillion US dollars available for developing countries to allocate to clean up the ANR and the carbon sequestration to get that going. You need a team of people to do that. That's what our team brings. But in addition to that, we can go out and create a risk mitigation approach through a public-private partnership that David would help us with that allows us to do the following. We go out, the development banks would go out and receive allocated funds from GFANZ for their country, and through their central bank and either the development bank part of the central bank, or if they have their own independent development bank, that's where the funds would go. That's what's required by GFANZ. But then the question becomes, okay, what do you do with the money and how do you allocate it and how do you keep track of it? The beauty of the climate bond initiative, or the climate bonds that are issued in Europe, as both Mike and Jake have articulated, is they are highly regulated. They have what are called taxonomies. And the first taxonomy we would approach is known as the waste management taxonomy. That's a taxonomy that stipulates that you take brownfield entities, brownfield determined by definition in the EU, not in third world or developing countries or in the United States or anybody else's definition. We use their definition because it's that regulation. But their definition is entities that have waste, like waste facilities, or people who haul waste, or people who are trying to deal with the waste that they're being overwhelmed with. We would form that entity. That's the brownfield. Our entity would come in. We would form a joint venture through a private-public partnership and convert that into a greenfield definition. Not 95%, not 99%. It has to be 100% according to the taxonomy of the Climate Bond Initiative. Now, why is the Climate Bond Initiative important? I think both Mike and Jake have touched upon it. It's the only bond that is rated by Fitch, Morningstar, and other rating agencies. The other green bond categories are not. And why is that important? Because GFANZ will now know that if they go with us and we use a climate bond to track and measure everything we're doing, there can be no concept known as greenwashing. Greenwashing is where people say, oh, I'm going to clean up this area, and then they don't do it. So essentially, and that's happened around the world. It's happened throughout Asia. It's happened throughout Europe. It's happened in the United States. So we need to prevent that from happening. And one of the ways to risk mitigate that or reduce the risk is to get a climate bond involved. And the material that we create from that can be used locally, but also can be used in other markets around the world. And as Mark indicated, there are over 100,000 markets out there that can use this material that is pyrolyzed, converted from waste into a material known as char. And there's different types of chars depending on the feedstock. So basically, the answer to your question is we risk mitigate using the climate bond for GFANZ, and that is the difference that no one else can bring to the table right now. We have already received a letter of fit for a waste management climate bond. Now, there are other taxonomies. There are agricultural taxonomies. There are other, there is green building taxonomies. There is cargo shipping taxonomies. They're even now working on one for hydrogen, although that seems to be problematic because the technology that is being funded for that, not through a green bond, but through other mechanisms, is really underwritten by big oil, big coal, big ag, big chemistry, so that they continue to say they're being green. And their problem is that scientifically they're not developing that because they're using the technology known as BECCS, which is a biocarbon economics of converting the waste into carbon, but for energy purposes. It can be done, but it's got to be pyrolytic carbon capture and storage technology. That is the key. There are other technologies like gasification and others. So that's basically it in a nutshell. I also want to answer this question from Madi asked the question, why is it time for the climate emergency finance? Well, my answer is pretty straightforward. The physical climate risks are rising, and climate shocks have become more frequent and severe. Now, there are people out there that deny that. And there's always going to be people that think that 2 + 2 = 3, but that's their prerogative. But the reality in the science shows that climate shocks are there. They're more frequent and more severe. And even if emission reduction efforts succeed and the world meets the goal of holding average temperature increases to well below 2 degrees centigrade and limited to 1.5 degrees centigrade, there are some changes already locked into our planet, into our planetary systems that will have unavoidable consequences whether we like them or not. However, in the coming decades, climate shocks are set to become the norm, and we need to offset that norm. We need to bring back the climate to what we saw prior to the last 20, 30 years. So preparing for these shocks requires the deployment of trillions of US dollars from a variety of sources of finance and presents an enormous investment opportunity. And the best mechanism to do that is taking GFAN's funds, allocating them to the development banks in development countries, and getting them to partner in public partnerships together with us so that we can use climate bond financing not so much as financing, but as that helps because it reduces the risk to GFANs and to the development banks, but it also gives a strict taxonomy approach to reduce greenwashing to the development world. And as Mark pointed out, if we have local people, you mentioned an example of 3,000 families that are trying to clean up waste and they don't want to change because they don't want to lose their jobs. Well, the good news is if they become part of our alliance, not only do we create jobs for them, but they have better value jobs than what they're currently earning now. So the critical component of this is to be able to get out there and get our message out there.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Definitely, if you can solve this kind of financial challenges of the developing world, definitely I believe that many of the organizations and they will support your initiative. Professor David Speak. Another important thing is policy. Definitely, we are discussing about GFANs. It's from G20. They have their policy for financing. On the other hand, developing world, from my practical experience, I know they have dependency to the developed world for developing their policy. How we can minimize the gap because policy play a major role for managing public-private partnership. What is your advice? How we can work? Even I just want to share a good news that World Talent Economy Forum, we are working with Indian governments and we will train government employee for public-private partnership. I want to welcome all of the experts who can help World Talent Economy Forum to train the government employees.
Well, Sri, policy plays a major role. And policy is very interesting because today policy tends to look locally and sometimes ignores your neighbors. Sometimes it ignores the rest of the global view. So part of what you have to do as you work policy, you have to impact the global view in something as global as the economic climate change issues. Because what I do regionally has an effect locally, but not solving the problem. So that type of policy there. The other thing that really helps when you look at policy, particularly in developing nations and others, is something called dual use technologies. So it's something that can serve a need to help advance the climate emergency, but also serve local needs. I can tell you with one of the projects I'm involved with in the CARICOM, the Caribbean region, we are putting biomass plants there to generate power, but also to generate fertilizer, also to be able to create jobs that help support the region. Also, as we're doing that, we're producing heat during the biomass that is being used for other industrial applications and things. So you have something that is helping them directly with climate change, but it's also doing all these other things to give benefits locally as well. And particularly as I look in the developing nations, the policy is going to be more effective in being used in developing nations where you can pull these type of dual use technologies in. And they're more likely to change some of their policies with that, which will attract the financing you need from things like International Development Bank, World Bank, these out of Brussels and others, to enact those changes if you can go through this multiple dual use type of approach. And I think that's one of the big keys in developing nations, of being able to pull them into the ecosystem view as opposed to just the close regional view.
Thank you. Mr. Mark Sabin and all of other speakers, I want to emphasize on awareness. Even our audience actually asks some questions, especially climate change is an emergency for everyone, everywhere. How do you agree with the statement? Noor Fadrin has sent things. He want to know, he need to know about the climate emergency. So that is more important. We need to create awareness. Even though COP26 and these are the things we are observing, many like political figures, corporations, and academic person, they join in these kind of big corporations. But I can assure you, 90% people, they do not have too much of understanding and knowledge about these climate change related challenges. How, example, World Talent Economy Forum, we have another initiative, School of Talent Economy. Already we provide training to many developing nations people. Recently we are start working with Rwanda. We are training the Rwanda peoples 100% online. So Mr. Mark Savin, Hena, Mike, Ruby, and Mr. Jack, if you give us some guideline how we can create awareness to the grassroots level people, because our target to the grassroots level people in the developing world. Mr. Mark.
So I think one of the things that we need to do, and I think that is it gets fairly evident, I think, even in local communities, that they're dealing with a lot of the, we're seeing sea levels rise in low-lying communities. This is making this quite obvious to the local population. Where we have a disconnect is that some of the major larger corporations and some of the first world countries are still being able to act in a form of denial about what's happening in terms of what's going on in terms of environmental degradation and destruction. And that as we are educating more and more of the population that this problem is not only obvious, it's an existential problem, but it's also an urgent problem because the level of destruction is happening much more quickly. And now we're seeing more and more that this is becoming part of the general conversation that's happening. But the educational part of it is that people are not seeing that there are possible solutions. And one of the things that happens, I think, for people that become afraid of what the dangers are that are coming and the situation that looks rather ominous to them is that we need to be able to provide ideas that further the conversation in a different way. What are the solutions that we can provide? That's a different conversation than one where we're just simply talking about the problem and concerns and worries about the problem, but we actually have to change that conversation. So one of the ways that we have been doing this, and that's part of the technologies that we have amalgamated into what we're doing, is that we are looking not for one specific technology that we're trying to promote. We're trying to promote the solution. The solution is, how do we actually address climate repair and climate restoration? That is a bigger mission than saying, oh, I have a great idea here and I want to use my technology and sell my technology, which is a more self-serving kind of approach to things. This is reversing the approach to saying, how do we solve the problems here that are global problems, but how do we solve them at a local level? And that's a process of educating people that there are solutions out there, that those solutions actually involve bringing together a collaborative process of other technologies, of other experts. This is why people like David are so important, because they understand how to put these systems into place. And the opportunity that we're discussing today is, how do we finance this? How do we support that? How do we actually get the investment initially involved in that? But then also to look at it that the investment, it's like any other kind of investment, it's because we're actually generating revenues and profits and solutions to those local economies where we're putting in. So all these things kind of fit together into a whole view, like a different paradigm shift of how we educate people to be oriented towards solving the problem, not just sitting there and dreading the problem that we're facing.
Thank you. Hannah, specifically if you focused on women empowerment, because in the developing world we are working with many women, when climate change and this kind of challenges come, women actually actually they suffer a lot in the grassroots level. They suffer a lot. Even I have one of my PhD on glass ceiling factors. This is really big problem. For the climate change, this is also a big problem. Glass ceiling factor, women empowerment. We want to focus on women empowerment. So what is your advice? How you can guide us for developing a better strategy for women?
Well, if I can use the example of the fashion industry, and I also think I'll be able to answer one of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat here. The climate crisis is an issue of equity, and as Mark and Jake kind of already touched on, climate emergencies disproportionately impact communities in the developing world, and of course, they also disproportionately impact women. And in the example of the fashion industry, it's one of those situations where women in communities in the developing world are underpaid for their work. And to answer your question, at the grassroots level, information is critical. So in an age where climate financing takes precedence and is proven to provide value for all stakeholders, giving grassroots organizations and particularly ones that give women more opportunities to engage in viable solutions, and allowing them the opportunity to benefit from their work, I think is a step in the right direction. And we see that happening with some nonprofits, and we see that starting to kind of take hold in climate financing. And I think that is a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Madam Ruby, what is your advice, especially for grassroots level women, those who suffer a lot for climate change, and how we can work together for solving this problem?
I hope I can speak to you more on like an equality basis for women and men, because really my final thoughts have to do with more of making sure that people from developing countries make the right checks and take the right measures to implement the right climate action, and to follow correct laws, because the easier way to do things is to just do them the most convenient way. But I think the one thing developing countries can learn, and the people from developing countries can learn from the more developed countries in terms of climate repair and restoration, is that it's important to select the right technologies. Make sure that you test things in the right ways through universities. Get the correct certifications and make sure that you take the right measures to ensure that you have viability to implement your products in the best way possible for your communities. And I think it's so important to do that with all of the different types of selection there is out there, that people be more discerning about what they decide to do with different implementations, whether it's finance or technology or education. Be more selective. There's an abundance of choice these days, and I think that's the best thing people can do. I'm really short on time, so thank you so much, Sharif, for letting us have this talk and letting me have my final talk. I'm going to leave you now, but thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful one, and
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This is really great discussions. I request all of our audience, please share our content with your government, with your corporation, and with your academy. And definitely this kind of dialogue actually help us to understand what the best strategy we can take from developing world. And definitely advanced resilient technology, ETT, they are the corporation who can solve many problem of the developing world. And World Talent Economy Forum actually collaborating with this kind of corporation, because they can help a lot of human in the developing world. So thank you everyone for joining today's session. I directly want to go for the concluding remarks. First, I request Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Sharif, and thank you for having this panel. This is going to be the first in a series. we're going to be addressing not just the finance component of it, but how finance gets implemented. I mean, this is just an introduction to the concept, but we have to act fast. Time is of the essence. And in order to do that, we need to work together with the development banks and the central banks in the developing countries. And we need to do that through Sharif and David and the rest of the team. We look forward to making that happen. And in the next set of series, I will share with Sharif what some of the topics are, but some of them will be not just the technologies, but also the mechanisms in which technologies make a difference and when they don't. I think that's important, as Ruby had just outlined. But also, in addition to that, how innovation plays a role in this process. And when I speak to innovation, I'm not just talking about the technology, but innovation of deployment, of being able to use this financial mechanism to solve the most fundamental issues, which is not just the people issue. In other words, can you put people to work making a decent living, a quality of life, improving their quality of lives, and at the same time improving the environment, which is the second component, which is the planet, and the third thing, allowing people to make a profit, fair profit at the same time. So, and Mark likes to call it people, planet, and profit. So that's what we look forward to in the future and on future programs.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks today?
My concluding remark on this is a great first step to begin to put together the means to not only understand what needs to be done, but how to finance what needs to be done, how to put structure around what needs to be done to address this grand challenges. Because where public-private partnerships make so much sense is when you're addressing large problems, grand challenges, other elements like that. And this does constitute is one of the grand challenges, not just our regions are facing, but we're globally financing. So Sharif, Marshall, great step for moving us forward towards action. Because you have to start with information, which becomes data, which becomes knowledge, which becomes wisdom. But the goal is to move all those into action. And this is a great step.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mark, what's your concluding remarks?
Yeah, I want to just add to what's been said here. First of all, thank you, Sharif and Marshall, for hosting this. But one of the things that we're facing with this and why this discussion is so important is because what we're talking about is really global infrastructure changes that we need to implement. These are not small tasks that we're undertaking where we can just solve a small problem in one little area. And the reason that this sort of financial support is so important is because in order to do this, not just on an industrial scale, but really on a global infrastructure scale, because we're trying to turn something that's been progressing for probably the last 300 years since the Industrial Revolution, where we have been changing the way that humanity has lived. And now we're entering into a new era. And as we come into that era, and as we're looking into how we preserve this planet for the living people and for all the other creatures who inhabit this planet, we need to be able to do things that will actually support life in a new way. And in order to do that, it's going to take a global effort. It's going to take, as we like to say in the naval world, all hands on deck. And that's what we need to do. So thank you for hosting this.
Thank you. Hannah, what's your concluding remarks?
I would say that to protect our future, it's imperative that we respect the intersectionality of climate-related issues, and to take a multidisciplinary approach to tackling them. The phrase "think globally, act locally" comes to mind, and while it's important to understand the issues on a global scale, it's equally important to understand how the individual choices we make every day impact those global systems. And we have the UN SDGs, right? And developing a framework with achievable goals shows how realistic organizational change is possible. And I think we need to bring equity and opportunity back to cities, incentivizing large corporations to consider the interconnectedness of their value chain, to public health and social change as well.
Thank you. This is really great discussions, and we will arrange 5 more sessions because we planned with Mr. Marshalls and Professor David Smith that we will arrange a series on climate change. This is very, very important session. This is really important for developing world, and we have to take action. That is important. So, World Talent Economy Forum, we believe in actions. We take actions, and definitely with the help of Mr. Marshall, Professor David Smith, Mr. Markley, and Mark Sabine and Hena, maybe we can develop the new world. So I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible. And any organizations want any kind of challenges for the climate change, I'm sure these are the corporations, they are happy to help the developing world corporations. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.